You're listening to a podcast from the BBC World Service. This is Hardtalk with me, Stephen Sacker. Thanks for downloading this edition of the programme. I do hope you enjoy it. Welcome to Hardtalk on the BBC World Service with me, Stephen Sacker. The Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe was set up more than 40 years ago to prevent conflict between the West and the Soviet bloc. Since then, it's provided a forum for former Cold War foes to talk. Made up of 57 member states, the OSCE now stretches across Europe to Central Asia, and it includes the US. It's headed by veteran Italian diplomat LambertoZannier. With such a diverse mix of interests and with no real power of enforcement, is the OSCE a useless relic of a bygone age? Well, LambertoZannier joins me now. Welcome to Hardtalk.
Thank you.
You have more than 50 member states, the European nations and nations far into Central Asia as well. They all rhetorically commit themselves to freedom, security, democracy. The problem is that they don't really mean it, half of them. Isn't that the thing that undermines your organisation?
I wouldn't say that it undermines. It gives us an agenda, it gives us a strong agenda, and gives us a lot of work, unfortunately. And yes, we've seen, and we're in a situation where we see deeper divisions in Europe. We see confrontation. We see armed conflict reappearing on European soil, which we were not really expecting a few years back. And we see challenges to the principles, the fundamental principles of the organization. So that means a lot of work for us.
But the problem is that from its very get-go, the idea was that you would bring together nations who were enemies rather than friends. So you had to let everybody into the club, as it were. It's not like the European Union, where you have to qualify by meeting all of the different accession conditions. So half of your members are repressive states which don't allow a free press, which are, frankly, authoritarian, if not dictatorships, and you do nothing to control your membership.
Well, that's not true. We have institutions. We have institutions like the High Representative on National Minorities, or the Representative on the Freedom of Media, or the office in Warsaw dealing with human rights and democratic institutions that do engage with everybody in the OSCE, and in some areas there is more work to do than in others. We have a system.
Have you ever suspended or kicked out a member nation of the OSCE?
Well, it has happened in the early 90s, but there is a debate around this, and there are some who say the consensus rule is a problem. We should move to some kind of a different way, either consensus -1 or a voting system, a majority system. However, there is a strength with the consensus itself. Everything we do on the basis of consensus, take our engagement in Ukraine, for instance, now. We're engaging there with the consent of Ukraine, with Russia, the United States, the Europeans, Turkey, everybody else. The fact that everybody is there and engages gives legitimacy to what we do. So in a way, it turns into a strength for the organization.
But frankly, you only keep that consensus and that legitimacy from all as long as you don't do very much. That's the problem. And let me just quote you words from Vladimir Putin, not from this year or last year, but from 2007, when he said there is a danger of the OSCE becoming, his words, a vulgar instrument for foreign policy interests of a small group of countries. He was suspicious of you then. He's even more suspicious of you now.
Well, working with Russia is not easy for us, I have to say, but one of my jobs is to find a space to work with Russia as well. And I think that's the whole point about the organization. We provide a framework within which we engage with everybody. And because we are a security organization, we take into account the fact that different actors and different players in our organization have a very different perspective and have very different understanding of the security situation and the security challenges for them. So this is where we differ a lot from NATO or the European Union. We don't have a core political agenda, core vision of a common security.
No.
We have very different perceptions.
There are so many differences, I don't know where to begin. But the difference, let's say, with NATO, for one, is that they can deliver on strategic policies they have, and they can deliver, not least, with weapons if they have to.
Exactly.
You cannot. You're entirely toothless. So let's talk Ukraine. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty and talk about your activities in Ukraine. There you are on the ground. I think in the country as a whole you have at least 500 staff. essentially most of them observers.
It's over 1,000 now.
Is it? And most of them are observers in eastern Ukraine, looking at the conflict zone itself, trying to figure out what's happening. In a sense, you're the eyes and ears of the international community on the ground in East Ukraine. But the trouble is, none of your staff can intervene in any way. They can do nothing. They have no weapons even to defend themselves, and they are at the mercy of the forces on the ground.
Well, first of all, my answer to that is that we are the only international organization which managed to engage in that context. And we manage that exactly because we're inclusive, because everybody is part of it. And of course,
no, you manage that exactly because you're toothless.
No, I wouldn't say we're toothless. Let's look at this angle, for instance. There are two very different narratives of what's happening in Ukraine. And if you look at the Russian media and the way they describe the whole development in Ukraine after the Maidan process and everything, you hear a very different story from what we hear in the West.
And I suppose what I want to know from you is, with all of your insight and your people on the ground and the reporting you get from your staff, which of the narratives is closer to the truth? What is the truth?
Well, the truth, we try to report back on what we see on the ground, and that is the ears and eyes of the international community, as you put it. And that allows the international community to see where reality is distorted.
Please answer my question then, because we have these different narratives. This very day, one of your senior staff on the ground has said that such is the scale of ceasefire violation at the moment, there is a danger of serious escalation. Now, he hasn't ascribed responsibility for that. I'm asking you to front up with me, which narrative has been correct in the past, and who is responsible for the ceasefire violations today?
On the narrative side, I would say, first of all, that we see on both sides attempts to, how can I say, undermine a situation that would lead on the ground, with actions on the ground, that would lead to progress on the Minsk, on the implementation of the Minsk agreements.
So you're saying equivalence, that both sides are equally at fault for the state that the East Ukraine conflict is in?
Well, the notion of equality is difficult.
Well, then if you don't believe in equality, tell me which side do you regard as more culpable?
In terms, for instance, of access, one of the problems we have with the monitors on the ground, we have over 700 monitors there, and we keep having obstacles to our freedom of movement, especially in the separatist side.
So you're saying that when it comes to the freedom and independence of movement of your staff, the pro-Russian separatists are most responsible for stopping you doing what you want to do.
The majority of violations are there. And this, of course, is obscuring a little bit our ability to, or is undermining our ability to have a good understanding of what is going on. We are in a situation where we see a hybrid conflict. We see important amounts of heavy weapons, of ammunition appearing there. Because we cannot reach systematically. Well, we cannot reach systematically the border, so we don't see it crossing. But
because the Russians limit your access on their side of the border, and the separatists limit your access and control your movement on the Ukrainian side.
We have a border monitoring operation on the Russian side that was established at a time when only 2 border crossing points were not controlled by the Ukrainians. In the subsequent phase, other border crossing points were taken over by the separatists, but we could not expand the operation to cover those, so we don't see what's going through there. But then we see that there is a constant flow of ammunition, for instance, in that zone.
Let's get to the situation. So you have now ascribed more of the blame, certainly for the limitations on your operations in East Ukraine, to the pro-Russian separatists. You've done that today, so that's something you've put on the table. I want you to put something else on the table. Your man on the ground, Alexander Hug, has just reported, as I say, these signs of serious escalation. Now, he hasn't, as I understand it, said whom he believes is responsible. So I'd like you to tell me on Hardtalk who, right now, because of this very dangerous situation, you see as primarily responsible.
It is difficult to point a finger in that, but certainly one of the things that Alexander Hug has seen is that the two sides have come closer together to each other.
They're allegedly at one point on the front line just 50 meters apart.
Exactly. And in some cases we're seeing movement on the Ukrainian side. So the Ukrainian side has pushed forward. In some other areas it has been on the separatist side. So it is difficult in this situation to point the fingers. We need the cooperation of both to make progress. And we need the cooperation of all sides in Minsk to make progress at the political level, because at the end of the day, that's where the solution must come from.
In your opinion,
the political process.
Because you get reports every single day, perhaps you more than any other individual is aware of what is going on the ground. In your opinion, is the so-called Minsk II ceasefire deal, peace deal, call it what you will, is it dead?
No, but I think, first of all, it's the only way forward that we have. So we are investing everything we are having in facilitating and engaging with the negotiations with the sides. It is difficult. It's a very hard job.
How close are we to getting back to a hot war in eastern Ukraine?
I think there is a risk of escalation. What we have seen in recent weeks is, first of all, redeployment of some heavy equipment from holding areas further away from the line of contact to areas closer to the line of contact. In some cases, we've seen these heavy armaments in use.
And on both sides or on one side?
On both sides. We've seen that on both sides.
Well, I come back to the question then. I think the international community does rely on you to a certain extent. Please be as explicit as you can. How close are we right now to a resumption of the hot war, the active conflict in eastern Ukraine?
In this moment, I don't see, the preparations for an offensive. Let's put it this way. So we are not there, but we see more systematic violations of the ceasefire. We see the use of heavy weapons, and we are worried because this could mark the beginning of a phase where we'll see more intense fighting. And there are victims also on a daily basis there. So this is a dangerous conflict, and we need engagement of the international community. We need engagement in the Normandy format, including by Russia, because Russia obviously has a very strong influence on the separatist regime.
Well, I want to talk about Russia in a moment. Just one more point on this. Wouldn't it be better if the international community had armed peacekeepers on the ground in eastern Ukraine rather than your unarmed observer/monitors?
I raised this issue myself at some point because I was wondering, can we be and should we be more robust? But then at the end of the day, what we see is separatists that are not, lightly armed. They have heavy tanks, they have field howitzers.
And they're backed by Moscow, let's be honest about it.
What kind of a peacekeeping operation can you put in place if there is no consent on their side and if you have to go in with an enforcement mandate? First of all, the OSCE wouldn't be the right organization to do that. This would need to be
the only thing is that you've had vehicles torched, you've had your reconnaissance drones blocked and jammed so that they can't operate. You've even had, I believe, at least 11 of your staff held captive by the separatists. Maybe some of those incidents would not have happened if it had been armed peacekeepers rather than unarmed, toothless observers. Well,
you could argue also the other way around. You could have had also more serious incidents had you had armed peacekeepers and then the confrontation with the separatists, between the separatists and the armed peacekeepers. Then some of the things you're saying are right, but for instance, our aerial vehicles. We have pictures, and we show pictures to our countries because obviously we are transparent with them, and we show them what we see. So in many cases, yes, we are jammed, but in many other cases, we manage to see the military movements and we report back.
Maybe you're not going to say it, but I'll say it, that experts who've looked at this jamming of the aerial vehicles say that it most likely is coming with Russian technologies, which brings us back to Russia. Russia is one of the most important members of your organization because, as I said at the very beginning of this interview, your organization's roots are in trying to establish an East-West dialogue during the Cold War. You're inclusive in a way which would be completely undermined if Russia wasn't on board and buying into the concept of the OSCE. So you can't afford for Putin to walk away from the OSCE, and I would put it to you, that means that you have consistently soft-pedaled on what Mr. Putin is doing inside his own country.
I wouldn't say that either. First of all, on the conflict and where it started from, we have even one picture of one of those pieces of military equipment that were jamming our UAVs, and it is a system that is identical to a system used by the Russian Federation. So there is a strong suspicion that that's where it's coming from. So I can confirm that.
Fine. So look, the point is, you're committed as an and let's leave Ukraine out of this. Let's just now talk big picture. You are committed to boosting the forces of freedom, human rights, democracy. Look at Russia's record today on political repression, civil society intolerance, media suppression, electoral malpractice. On all of these key indicators of the health of a society, Russia, one of your most important members, is failing.
Yeah, you see, we don't pass judgments on single countries. I would have a list of countries to give you if you want to have.
Believe me, I've got a list too, and I'm going to go through them all with you.
You can
But the point is, Russia is really rather important because of the history of your organisation.
Of course, it is important, and the OSCE offers the platform for our countries to raise their concerns in this context. We have tools to address this. We have meetings where these issues are raised, and this is done consistently in the organization.
I know, but it comes back to whether there's any point to your organization. For example, let's just go through a few specifics. Crimea. You've last year issued a report on Crimea which expressed grave concern about human rights, media abuses in Crimea, but you're not actually, correct me if I'm wrong, are you actually allowed, your staff, your monitors, actually allowed into Crimea?
No, the monitors tried to go into, that was one, how can I say, one element of disagreement in the adoption of the decision, because the Russians made an interpretative statement at the time, arguing that Crimea was not covered by the mandate.
Russia's a key member of your organization, nominally committed to the pursuit of freedom, human rights, democracy, and they won't even let you into Crimea.
If I want to go to Crimea, the Russians might let me in at their conditions, so I'm assessing very clearly what that conditions would be, and I'm being very cautious on this.
Right,
because,
okay, well,
so
it seems like Crimea's off limits. When we start to look at practically what you can do, where you can go, the importance and the influence that your messages have, one gets very depressed. And maybe the fact that you can't, frankly, take on Mr. Putin's Russia and achieve anything in terms of real intervention, even real monitoring in Russia itself, is a signal to other countries. For example, Belarus has basically thrown you out after you didn't like their last election. Azerbaijan, thrown you out after you didn't like their last election. You know, I can carry on going through a list of countries which are members of your organization, but which absolutely refuse to have you in their country anymore and refuse to listen to the messages you send them.
Yeah. But these are not difficulties of the organization. These are difficulties that reflect the problems in the relationship between countries. And it's the countries themselves that have a problem in addressing these issues, and they have a problem in addressing them also in the organization.
But you have a problem too, a credibility problem, if you allow these countries, and we come back to the beginning of this conversation, to maintain membership of your organization. Chuck them out.
Well, then we become what? The European Union at the end of the day.
But then don't tell me that you are committed to the pursuit of freedom, democracy and human rights across the European space.
We are committing and continue to engage on these issues, both with the Azerbaijanis and with the Belarusians. We are engaging now with a set of projects to restart a very practical cooperation.
But on the question of credibility, be honest with me, was it a mistake in 2010 to give the chairmanship of your organization to Kazakhstan and to have the summit of the OSCE hosted in Kazakhstan, where President Nazarbayev has just won another election with 98% of the vote, and your own people saying that it was a fundamentally unfair election with a total lack of credible choice? Why did you allow Kazakhstan to host the OSCE summit?
Why not? Why do we want to pass judgments of countries beforehand? Why don't we give them responsibilities and then we push them to live up to their responsibilities? I think working with Kazakhstan, and I wasn't there at the time, I joined the organization only after the chairmanship, but working with countries with Kazakhstan on an agenda like the agenda of the OSCE, I think it's important. It's a way of moving them closer and to give them responsibility.
So you think it's made a difference to you?
Of the values of the
you did that in
organization.
2010 and now it's 2016 and we've just had Mr. Nazarbayev win a 98% majority. It made a difference, did it? He's heading in the right direction.
Well, that's a different issue, and on the issue of the elections, we keep working on them. We work with the electoral committee, but it's a question also of governance structure in some of these countries. If you look at the post-Soviet countries, many of them have similar governance structures, and we will need to go for the long haul. I think we will need time to change things in those places, but we need a space to engage.
It is a long haul. I'm just wondering about one other very important member state of your organization, Turkey. How tough do you believe the rhetoric should be on Turkey right now when we see newspaper offices being invaded by state officials, we see allegations of military abuses, we see a security situation that's deteriorating?
I think we need to work with Turkey on these issues. And on the freedom of media issue, there are statements of the OSCE already expressing concern for what we have seen happening.
The journalists who've lost their offices in Zaman, and we spoke to one the other day, I mean, they talk about him, Mr. Erdogan, the president, as a despot. They say that this is the death of democracy. You are supposed to be pushing for democracy across the European space. What do you think?
Absolutely. There is a problem there. We need to speak up. The OSCE
So do you see Mr. Erdogan as showing grave tendencies toward authoritarianism?
I see symptoms of that, certainly, and how can I say, freedom of the media for us is an important indicator also. So we need to work with Turkey on these issues, and our people dealing on freedom of the media are engaging with Turkey. Our people working on elections are engaging with Turkey. We had a mission also monitoring the elections.
As an Italian diplomat, as you were, you obviously watch what the European Union does very closely. Does it trouble you that in the midst of what you say is a very worrying trend in Turkey, the Europeans are offering Turkey serious carrots, including faster accession talks and visa-free travel, in order to get help and cooperation on the migration issue and the security issues? Does that worry you, that trade-off?
Well, there is a bit of a lack of foresight in all this. I have to say the Europeans have not, how can I say, reacted on time and have not seen the signals. We've been discussing this issue of Syrian refugees in Turkey 3 years ago, and the Europeans didn't take any notice and they didn't seem to be concerned. And now they're negotiating with Turkey under the pressure of a humanitarian emergency, and the risk is that we may end up with not a very good deal. Obviously, a negotiation under that kind of pressure is one where you may have to give more concessions that you were thinking of initially.
We've got to end, but you've been doing this job for 5 years, pretty much. It strikes me that your job's getting more and more difficult as the problems you face, not just in Europe but in the hinterland of Europe, get more and more profound.
It is difficult because the security challenges we are facing are much more complex than they used to be. We have a return of geopolitics, so we have competition among key powers. Regional conflicts are not getting any easier. At the same time, we have global challenges. From terrorism to now the large migration issue. I also see signs of interest to create coalitions to work against some of the global challenges, for instance on terrorism. So we also find areas where countries in fact do work together.
Okay, we have to end there, but LambertoZannier, thank you very much for being on Hardtalk.
Thank you.
That was an edition of Hardtalk presented by me, Stephen Sacker. For details of our complete range of podcasts and our terms of use, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.